We hear about crimes all the time. Some of them shock us for a day or two, but then there are the others, the ones that become these huge turning points, forcing an entire country to stop, look at itself, and completely rewrite its own rules. Today, we're going to look at those landmark cases, the ones that didn't just end with a verdict, but actually reshaped the laws of India.
This quote really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? It's about how something awful, something tragic, can somehow become the engine for real, lasting change. We're going to see how the stories of just a few people, their pain and their incredible courage, forced a massive legal system to evolve.
So where do we start? Well, let's go back to the 1970s. This decade was, well, it was a pressure cooker. It's when these fundamental questions about what it means to have rights, questions about consent, about dignity, about basic liberty, were just thrown into the national spotlight, really setting the stage for everything that came after.
Just take a look at this. The 70s were an absolutely transformative time. We're going to dive into the first and last cases on this list right now. Now, don't worry, we will come back to the heartbreaking story of Aruna Shanbhag later on. Her case lasted for over 40 years, and it brings up questions we're still wrestling with. So let's start with the case that basically ignited one of India's first major movements for women's rights. Okay, the details of this are they're horrifying. Mathura, a young girl, was assaulted by police officers, the very people who are supposed to protect you inside a police station. But the verdict from the Supreme Court, that's what left the entire nation speechless. They ruled that it was consensual. The verdict exposed this giant, dangerous hole in how the law even understood consent and power. But people were not about to let that stand.
The public was furious, and that outrage led directly to a critical change in the law. Now think about this. Before this case, the victim had to somehow prove she didn't consent. But afterward, for custodial rape, when the abuser is someone in authority, like a cop, the whole script got flipped. The burden of proof shifted to the accused. It was a massive, monumental step forward.
Now, not every law-changing case was a violent crime. Sometimes it was about protecting our civil liberties, and the ripple effects were huge. So imagine this. You're a journalist, Maneka Gandhi, and the government just seizes your passport. No explanation, no reason given. Well, she fought back, and her fight ended up changing the definition of fundamental rights for every single person in India. And this is the key takeaway. The Supreme Court came out and said that the right to life in Article 21 isn't just about, breathing. It's about the right to live a full life with human dignity. That one decision blew the doors wide open. It meant your right to travel, your right to privacy, even your right to a clean environment. All of a sudden, all of that was protected under this one powerful idea. So let's keep going into the next era. As we move into the 80s and 90s, this whole fight for dignity got a lot more personal. It expanded from these big abstract ideas about a citizen's rights and moved right into the most concrete places, our homes and our workplaces. Let me tell you about Shah Bano. She was 62 years old, divorced by her husband, and left with absolutely nothing. All she asked for was some basic financial support so she could survive. That simple plea for justice went all the way to the Supreme Court, and, well, it lit a fire under a nationwide debate about women's rights, religion, and the law.
And this is where you see this incredible tension. The Supreme Court sided with Shah Bano. They stood up for gender equality. But there was intense political pressure from conservative groups who saw this as interference. So what did Parliament do? They passed a new act that pretty much overturned the court's decision for Muslim women. It just goes to show you that progress isn't always a straight line, and it's why the debate over a uniform civil code is still a hot topic today.
The story of Bhawanri Devi is just one of incredible guts in the face of a broken system. She was a social worker, and she was brutally attacked for doing her job, for trying to stop a child marriage. And the worst part? The local courts completely failed her. Her attackers were acquitted, but her fight was far from over. Her case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And the court looked around and realized there was this massive legal vacuum. There were literally no laws to protect women from sexual harassment at work. So the court itself laid down the rules, the famous Vishakha guidelines. And those guidelines became the direct blueprint for the POSH Act in 2013, a law that now protects millions of women at work all across India, all because one woman refused to give up. Okay, now we're entering the new millennium, and a powerful new force steps onto the stage. 24/7 news media and a public that is more connected and vocal than ever before. This is the era when we see how pure public outrage, blasted across our screens, could become a force that the justice system simply could not ignore. This case was just chillingly straightforward. Jessica Lal, a model, was working as a bartender. A powerful politician's son demanded a drink, she refused, so he shot her dead. There were witnesses everywhere, and yet the initial verdict came back acquitted. It felt like the entire system had just failed right in front of our eyes.
This headline, it just perfectly captured the nation's disbelief, the collective anger. It became a rallying cry. It felt like a moment where everyone realized that justice wasn't just blind, maybe it had been bought and paid for. But that wasn't the end of the story.
What happened next was totally unprecedented. Fueled by non-stop media coverage, the public simply refused to accept the verdict. People organized protests, candlelight vigils, even text message campaigns. They created so much pressure that the case had to be reopened, and this time, justice was served. It was a true watershed moment. It proved that the voice of the people could actually turn the wheels of justice.
And then 2012 happened. The brutal assault of a 23-year-old student, who the world would come to know as Nirbhaya, was a crime so cruel, so horrific, that it felt like it shook the very soul of the country. The horror and the rage were immediate. People poured onto the streets, and they did not leave.
The public demanded change, and this time the government had to listen. The result was the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 2013, and it was passed in record time. The changes were massive. We're talking way stricter punishments for rape, and for the very first time, offenses like acid attacks, stalking, and voyeurism were specifically defined as crimes. This gave people real, legal tools for their safety that just hadn't existed before.
So as we've seen through all of these stories, the law isn't some fixed, static thing. It's alive. It breathes. It evolves because of tragedy, because of courage, and because of public demand. It is, and it will always be, a journey.
And now we come back to that story we mentioned earlier, the one that spanned decades. Aruna Shanbhag, a nurse who was brutally attacked in 1973 and spent the next 42 years in a vegetative state. 42 years. Her tragic, long suffering forced the entire legal system to confront one of the hardest questions there is. What does dignity mean at the very end of life?
In hearing her case, the Supreme Court made a landmark, compassionate decision. It legalized passive euthanasia, which is essentially the withdrawal of life support. It recognized a right to die with dignity, allowing a person to pass peacefully under very strict conditions, when there's no hope of recovery. Aruna's suffering ultimately brought a new, humane layer to Indian law.
And that really just says it all. Every one of these cases, from Mathura to Aruna, from Jessica to Nirbhaya, they're all milestones on this long, long journey. They're painful reminders of where society has failed, absolutely, but they're also these powerful testaments to our ability to change.
These cases changed Indian law forever. No question. They pushed the nation toward being a little more equal, a little more safe. But as we think about all the pain and all the courage that it took to force these changes, you're left with a pretty sobering thought. How many more tragedies will it take for justice to become proactive instead of just reactive? And that's a question for all of us to think about.